세 번째 발표는 미국 뉴욕주시 의원이시죠. 린다 리님께서 함께 해주시겠는데요. 린다 리 의원께서는 뉴욕 한인봉사센터 회장을 역임하셨고요. 미국의 경제문화 중심지인 뉴욕시에서 최초로 한인시 의원으로 작년 2021년 11월에 당선된 분이십니다. 여러분 린다 리 의원님을 박수로 맞아주시기 바랍니다.
Hello, good morning. Still morning, right? I'm gonna just switch this because I don't like seeing, I think it's odd seeing a photo of my face up here, so. I should actually, wait, how do I, hold on. So, good morning everyone, my name is Linda Lee, and I actually should probably take lessons from Benedict on how to do PowerPoint presentations because I'm horrible at them, so literally all I did was just stick a bunch of pictures together because I figured it's more fun to have visuals than words, and so that was sort of the direction that I took. But yeah, so myself as well as Julie Wan, we are the first Korean Americans ever to get elected to the New York City Council. And yeah, it's so crazy that there has never been. And to be honest, I'm very humbled, first of all. I just want to say I'm very humbled and honored to be here, even talking to all of you, because I know in this room there are so many people who have come before us and before me to sort of create that pathway. And so I feel very honored to be able to share my story with all of you. And I think a lot of the stories that I'm going to share about my life, I'm sure everyone also can relate to. I am definitely second gen Itae all the way. I was born and raised in New York, and I was actually born in upstate New York, Elmira. I don't know if anyone knows where that is, but it's somewhere between Ithaca and Binghamton, where there's no minorities at all, except for our family that somehow heard that that's a great place to immigrate to, so we ended up there. My father actually came to the US in the 70s to study at Ohio State University for his master's degree, but like many other immigrants, when we moved to New York, it was much more lucrative and it made more sense for him to be a small business owner. So him and my mom actually were dry cleaning 세탁소, business owners for 30 years. And I think that's where I learned that work ethic. I feel like there's something to be said about Koreans and their work ethic, which is, not to be, discounted. And so for me, I saw my parents, how they struggled, the discrimination that they faced being in New York, because even in New York, where we grew up when I was younger in Long Island, there were a lot of divides, discrimination. The Korean community at the time when I was growing up there was not that large. It was mostly in Queens, in New York City, where the Korean community was, and then they slowly sort of have been moving out east as they've become more successful and as they get more into their businesses. And so for me, I basically decided after college to move to China for a year. So I was in Yeonbyeon, Yanji, teaching English for a year, as well as doing missionary work because I thought I wanted to do that possibly for the rest of my life. And so it was really there in that first year teaching in China where I learned, okay, I want to help people, I just don't know how. And I came back and I ran into a friend of mine from church that I hadn't seen in 10 years at a John Mayer concert, don't judge me, at a John Mayer concert. I hadn't seen her in 10 years and she had just started social work school at Columbia. And that was actually, to be honest, the first time I had heard about social work because I majored in economics in undergrad thinking, yeah, I want to go into business and finance, investment banking. But I feel like social work in the public sector is not really a field that a lot of our parents talked about or really encouraged. So when I actually looked into social work more, I was like, wow, there's a whole entire field that's just dedicated to helping people. So I knew that this is what I wanted to do. So I went to social work school, studied mostly on the administrative side of how to run nonprofit organizations, because I thought in my head what I really wanted to do and the best way to impact the community was help the nonprofit organizations become stronger so that the frontline staff can do their job better. And so that was really where my heart and passion was. And so I was working at a foundation, which is how I found out about KCS, Korean Community services. And at KCS, that's where I first learned, I mean, this is just, you know, shame on me kind of moment, but I didn't realize, because I had only grown up in a lot of the mainstream culture in New York, and so I didn't realize that there were so many Asian and Korean nonprofit organizations that were helping the community in New York. And so when I started working at KCS, I was the only second-gen staff that they hired. I was coming in at a very high position as the number 2 person, because the reason why they hired me is because they wanted to make that transition from first gen to second gen. So it's the oldest and largest Korean-serving nonprofit in New York, and I was the first, not first, but I was the only at the time second gen person, and I knew I had a lot of challenges to face because I didn't speak Korean fluently. I was younger at the time, and I was a woman, which, you know, to be honest, like, it was still primarily patriarchal, male-dominated organization, and so it took me a long time to really build the trust of the community. And I felt like, you know what, if anything, I felt like my calling at the time working at KCS was to really be that bridge to transition the organization from the first generation to the second generation. And I have to say, it was really, it was really during my time here at KCS that I really understood why government and legislation and policy is so important to what we do on the ground. Because we had 6 locations in New York City. We ran 2 senior centers. I actually was started up. It took me 4 years, but I started. It's still the only outpatient mental health clinic that is run by a Korean nonprofit organization in New York State. And it took me 4 years to do that, and through that process, I learned so much about how broken our system is, and how much we need to fix, and how it's very challenging for a lot of immigrant communities to start those types of programs and services. So it was really, really through my work, because we you know, KCS now has grown. When I first started, our budget was about 3.5 million, and now our budget is about 10 million. And so we have grown quite a bit, and a lot of the funding that we receive is from the city. It's mostly from the city, from New York City, as well as state and federal as well. But we partnered a lot with our local government, and that's really where I began to see and understand how important it was to have that relationship. And also, in New York City, and I'm sure other cities across the US, we face the model minority myth, right? So there's this idea like, oh, all Asians are successful, you guys don't need help, you all go to graduate from Harvard and you're doctors and lawyers, but actually there's a lot of issues underneath the surface that no one talks about. And I'll just be very transparent. I have very close family members and friends that have severe mental illness, bipolar, schizophrenia, suicide attempts, and so that's why for me this issue area was very, very important for us to break that stigma in the Korean community and to really build programming around that. And so, you know, in the work that we did, it was very important to partner with our local government to be able to get the funding for those programs, and also to be able to advocate for policies that impact the Asian community. So in New York City, we are the fastest growing population, more than any other ethnic minority group. So when I first started at KCS in 2009, the Asian community was about 12%. Now we are more than 18% of New York City's population, but we only receive about 1% of all the funding in New York City. We just passed a $101 billion budget. That's a budget that is larger than some countries. And so that money, if you think about it, only about 1% was going towards the Asian community, and the population is now more than 18%. So there's a huge discrepancy there, and there's a lot of needs that are growing in our community. It is also very diverse. So when you say Asian, it's not just East Asian, but it includes South Asian, Pakistani, a lot of new immigrants coming over from Southeast Asia as well. So there are a lot of needs in New York City that are competing with each other. So it was really through my work at KCS where I saw the importance of how we need to work together. And I'm sure like many other people, who are in office right now, I mean, for me personally, this was never ever something that I wanted to do or thought about doing. And honestly, even looking back at the campaign last year, I feel like I must have been crazy to have done something like this. And I don't know what possessed me to do it. But it was really because, you know, last year and the past couple years with the pandemic, we saw so much happening in our country and in our city. There was the Black Lives Matter movement, there was civil unrest, there was the Me Too movement, there was Asian hate happening like crazy. Especially in New York, a lot of the Asian seniors and women are the ones that are being constantly targeted for the Asian hate crimes. And so, you know, KCS at the time when I was still there, we were part of a broad coalition to, you know, really address the Asian hate crimes that were happening in New York City. And let the community know these are the resources that we have, this is what you can do, this is how you report a crime. And it's difficult because if you don't speak English, people feel uncomfortable to come forward. And plus in New York, for something to be considered a hate crime, the bar is very, very high. So so that's the problem and issue too, is that we're working with the DA's office as well as the court systems to figure out how we can address that and make it easier. So that was actually largely why I decided to run, and there were some people that were kind of like egging me on. So there's this one person, I don't know if you guys have that, but there was this one person that called and I was like, oh, I know why he's calling, and I don't know if I should pick up this call, but it was during a time where it was August of 2020. And it was in the midst of all the craziness. You know, I was going into work every day, even though people were staying home, because guess what? The seniors still need to be fed. We still need to deliver food to them. We still need to provide services. So the nonprofit community, I feel like, were really essential workers in the trenches during the pandemic. And I just mentally, emotionally was so exhausted already at that point. And so when I got that call in August, it was something that people had sort of been encouraging me to do. But I was like, you know what? Maybe now's the time. So I spent a couple weeks doing the exploratory calls, talking to different folks to see if this is something that I should think about or do. And then I decided, okay, you know what? I'm going to do it. So from then on, and I've never run a political campaign before. These were the 6 opponents that I had. And in Julie's race, actually, she had 19 people we were running against. So New York City is one of the few cities that decided through the city charter to implement ranked choice voting. I don't know how many of you guys know what that is, but instead of picking one candidate, you pick your top 5 in order of preference. So New York City decided for the very first time, so we were the first ones last year to go through ranked choice voting, and it's only at the city level. It's not state, it's not federal, it's only New York City. And the reason why the previous council decided to put that forward for a vote to the residents is because they wanted to encourage people from all walks of life to run for office. And they also changed the campaign finance. So in New York City, we have matching funds. So for anyone who's running, for the first $175 of donations you get in campaign, the city matches it 8-1. So the idea behind that was to make it easier for just everyday folks to run for office. And so you saw last year in the city council, there's 51 council members. And it's funny because Steve King, everything you were saying about redistricting, we're going through that now. And in fact, in Queens right now, in the US, there is a public hearing going on right now for redistricting for Queens County, which is where I represent. So there are 51 council members, and we each have 170,000 residents. And we can only deviate about 5% above or below that. We definitely don't make as much as LA. I don't know, maybe I should move there. That's a lot. That's a $240,000 salary. Ours is about 150 or 154. But we have about 170,000 residents per district. And same thing, we get $5 million in discretionary for capital funds, as well as an additional couple million for programmatic discretionary money. And similar to LA, a lot of the policies, legislation, buildings, any of that stuff needs to go through the city council. So very similarly to LA in a lot of ways, New York has a lot of power. Sometimes it seems much more so than the state or other parts of government as well. Because we have 8.8 million residents, we just passed a budget of $101 billion. And so between the 51 council members along with the mayor, we have a lot of say in terms of where the funding and the resources go in New York City. So that's why, a lot of folks at the city council, if you want to build any new developments, if you want to do any of that stuff, usually you have to go through your local city council member. If the council member says no, usually the project does not go forward. And so there's a lot of that goodwill relationship building that has to happen with your local city council members, which is why I've noticed, to the previous session's question, Korean community has actually gotten much more active in the last 5-10 years in New York. I think the first gen and second gen have been working closely together because I think the first gen realizes that they have to also encourage and lift up the second gen and the next generation to be able to represent. And it's not just representing the Korean community, but it's really having that understanding and perspective from the community, because I think it's different to have that lived experience as an immigrant versus someone from the outside to represent your community. So for me, for example, my district, which people would never think of because I'm on the border of Long Island and Queens. But my district has the second highest Asian Americans in all of New York City. But it's not where the concentration of Koreans are. So I have about 45% Asian Americans, but of that 45%, half of them are South Asian, and the other half are East Asian. So mostly Chinese in the East Asian side, some Koreans. And then on the South Asian side, it's split between the Sikh community, Bangladesh, Pakistani community. There's a lot of different groups within that South Asian community. So that's why in New York City, it's interesting. You can't just cater or represent your own. You have to really think about the wider coalition building and how to represent your community. So it's funny because especially in the South Asian community, when I got elected, they're like, we know you're not our Asian, like our kind of Asian, but still we feel very proud and happy that for the very first time in my city council district, there was an Asian representative, because everyone before me, they were white men. There was never before a woman and never before an Asian American. And I gotta say, during the campaign, I was very intimidated, and I wasn't sure if people were ready in my district to represent, and elect an Asian American, especially a woman. But surprisingly, what I noticed is that when you talk about the issues that are important to the community, that really unifies so many people. And we knocked on our campaign. I think the way we won is myself and Jasleen, who's the middle person on the top. She and I were 1 and 2. And our campaigns, the reason why I think we did so well is you gotta knock on the doors, right? So we knocked on, at least my campaign, we knocked on more than 30,000 doors. I personally knocked on more than 8,000 myself. So literally I took a few months off from KCS to just do campaigning full time. So I ended up door knocking from February till June, pretty much full time. So that's from extreme cold to extreme heat. And I remember it was so cold in March when we had to collect petitions that our pens kept freezing. So we had to keep a stock of pens in our bags so that we could have the signatures signed by residents. And it's very humbling experience to knock on that many doors and talk to that many people, but you learn so much about how there's actually, I know it sounds cliche to say this, but there's so much more that actually unifies us than divides us. And so, in all my conversations I've had with people during door knocking, it really solidified that sort of sentiment. And so it really was a very, very humbling experience. And to be honest, I know that we're all Democrats in this race. In this race, we're all Democrats, but it's interesting because only in New York City, I think, am I considered more moderate. Because I always thought I was very progressive and liberal, but in New York City, the left has gone much, much more further left, and so I was getting attacked from both the right and the left, which is very interesting, from my own party. So, and I was not endorsed by the county Queens Democratic Party machine. I was not endorsed by them. I wasn't endorsed by some of the, smaller parties like the Working Families Party. So I really was sort of the black sheep, I guess you could say, because I didn't have a career in politics where some of these other folks had run maybe 1, 2, 3 times already before. So I think there was some sort of, there was definitely that sentiment and competition, but I think the party decided to stay out because they weren't sure who to back or who was going to win. So literally we were just working on the ground, like I said, knocking on doors, just being out in the community, getting to know the folks and the residents, in the district. And some of the endorsements, to be honest, a lot of the folks didn't have the endorsements. I mean, I didn't get a lot of the endorsements in the beginning, but during the general election, once I won the primary, a lot more of the traditional, more endorsements came. The biggest endorsement I received during my primary campaign, though, was from the UFT, because I have the most amount of teachers that live in the district. But it's been quite a crazy 7-8 months. Julie and I both took office starting in January of this year. It has been absolutely insane. And, to be honest, it's very eye-opening, because now I get to represent not just the Korean community, but the Asian community and other immigrant communities from the other side of the aisle. And it's kind of cool when you get to see organizations and nonprofits and people that are doing great work and be able to say, yeah, we should actually put more money in the Asian Community Initiative funding, right? We should put more money into the hate crimes initiative. We should put more of these dollars and resources that impact our communities, right? And that's, I think, the important piece of why it's important to have representatives from our communities elected, because they have that perspective that perhaps other people would not. And so, for me, I know I may be one of the first. I don't want to be the last. I think one of my roles is to really create a pathway for the next generation or people to come right after me to run for office. And so whatever I can do to help, I think is something that I would love to try to do. And as council member, I'm very excited because I actually chair, so a lot of the council members, not all, but most of them chair different committees. And I happen to chair the Committee on Mental Health, Disabilities, and Addictions. And I feel very honored and privileged to be able to chair that committee because it's an issue area that's so important to me personally. And through that committee, we actually give about $22 million in funding to those different groups. So, I'm very fortunate to be able to also have hearings, create laws that make these services more accessible to people, because I think we need to make sure that, the services in the community, we continue to push those as much as possible, and it's all about accessibility. So, I serve on one of the most number of committees in the City Council. I have 9 committees that I serve on, which is a lot. So it is a lot of committees, but it's committees that I think are extremely important, not just to my district, but also to the Asian community, which I'm very excited about. And to have that voice and perspective is definitely eye-opening. And so that's my family. They're actually here with me in Korea. I know people are shocked that I actually married a Korean guy, and he's been very supportive, I have to say. And this is not an easy life on the family, and I'm constantly out all the time. And I don't get to see my kids as often as I would like, but I have a very, very supportive husband and family, and that's the only way that I would be able to do this work. And I think one of the most important lessons I've learned is that, for me, I'm a person of faith. My faith is very important to me, and I serve on my church leadership team. So one of the things that I asked people closest to me to pray for me about before I started the campaign is three things. I said I need lots of protection, right? Because I'm going to get attacked like crazy, whether it's online, Twitter, I hate Twitter, whether it's online or, personally, I'm going to get attacked, and so I need to have that protection so that I can just stay focused and do what I got to do. The second thing I asked for was wisdom. Not necessarily human wisdom, but godly wisdom, to have that discernment. Because I gotta say, there's a lot of battles. You gotta pick and choose what to fight. You have to have that discernment of how to address issues politically, personally. And so I really needed that wisdom. And the third thing I asked for was humility. Because I think it's very, very easy, and especially in the first 7-8 months, I've seen how it's very easy to fall into that trap to get power hungry and to want to continue to do this for other reasons than serving the community. So for me personally, coming from the social work background, I really wanted to make sure that people would pray for me, because I'm like, I need to remember my roots, why I'm doing this, where I came from, my community, my Korean roots. I have to remember and never forget the lessons I learned while I was working on the ground. So that was the third thing that I really asked for. And so those three themes have been very important for me throughout my career so far, my short career as an elected official. And it's something that has been carrying me throughout. And so very, very humbled to be here, like I said. Normally, the city council terms are 4 years, but because of redistricting, I have to run again next year, so does Julie, everybody. So it's 2, 2, and then 4. So we can only serve, we're term limited. So state and federal in New York, they're not term limited, but city council, we are term limited. So we can only run for 8 years consecutively. So we have to run again next year, which is why it's crazy, because we had to go through a first budget, and then we have to gear up pretty soon to run again next year. So it's been a little insane. It's been crazy, but a very good experience in the sense that, I'm able to use this position hopefully to empower other people in the community. So thank you so much.
네, 손 들어주시면 마이크 이동해서 도움드리겠습니다. 앞쪽에 마이크 전달 좀 부탁드립니다.
네, 린다 얘기 정말 잘 들었습니다. 목사가 안 되시고 정치인 하신 거 정말 잘하시는 결정입니다.
Oh my gosh, my Korean is so bad.
No, not 영어 할까요?
Oh,
네, 특히 저도 아까 말씀하신 I pray for you, the 3 items, okay? 네. I think that as a politician, sometimes you feel conflict between the demand of the Korean community and the demand of non-communities, because the Korean American who support you may demand too much for you. But you also should work for the Asian community and also other people. Then how we can make balance between these two different demands?
yeah. No, so I'm very thankful, because I think even the Korean community in New York has changed the mindset a lot, where they're not so much insular anymore, but they realize that in order to gain that voice, they need to build those coalitions with other groups, right? So it's not just about the Korean community, and to be honest, it's funny, I had a dinner recently with some of the first-gen ISHE Korean leaders in New York, and they actually said, our job as first-gen is to really not put too much, we shouldn't be putting too much pressure and burden on the second-gen, because we realize you guys have a task of representing not just the Korean community, but also your community overall and in general. And so I was actually very grateful, thankful, and surprised that they had that perspective, but they really they're able to see the bigger picture, and they understand now. So they're very supportive and happy, but understand that when I fight for the Asian community, that also benefits the Korean community as well.